Sixers fans are in mourning after the Celtics beat their ass and swept them in the first round of the Eastern Conference playoffs. And at the end of every season, it's tradition that I post some sappy video with some sappy music, sentimental music over all the best highlights of the year. But this year I am not making it because there were no good highlights outside of maybe the Christmas Day game against Milwaukee, maybe Ben Simmons hitting the 3 against the powerhouse Guangzhou Long Lions in an exhibition game, and maybe Shake Milton's 39-point game in a loss to the Clippers. Outside of that, there were no good times, and I'm not making it because no one wants to see it at this point. This Sixers season's death was an avoidable death. This is not the death of someone who did a lot of community service, who you had a lot of laughs with, a lot of great times with, and it was their time to go. No, this was a very avoidable death. This was the death of a child who's been neglected and abused by his parents his whole life, who one day they take him to the zoo and predictably lose their eye on him, then he wanders into the lion's cage and gets completely mauled. This is the death of a child who gets sick from a common cold, and instead of the parents fixing it, taking him to a doctor, giving him modern medicine, they insist on praying it away, and it gets worse and worse, and he dies and the parents go to jail. This was totally avoidable from the start, and I have 7 suspects who are responsible for this avoidable death. And that was hyperbolic, by the way. I don't think the silly game of basketball will ever reach the importance of a human life. Here are the 7 suspects responsible for the Sixers' death this year. The first, of course, have we beat this drum enough, is head coach Brett Brown. I'm not sure what needs to be said about Brett that hasn't already been said. He hasn't been officially fired yet, but by the time you're watching this video, he will probably be long gone. Brett had a lot of questionable moments during his time here. The rotations of certain players, the starting lineups, his relationships with certain players, his willingness to call or not call a timeout. His track record on the Sixers was not perfect, but I think there were some times where he definitely showed he was a good coach. The problem is he's a good coach, he's not a great coach. You figure with all the talent the Sixers have, regardless of whether or not it's a good fit, you think a great coach could have made it work at least better than what the fuck we saw against the Celtics. And really not just the Celtics, throughout his entire tenure with the Sixers. I'm not going to get into the rumors about his relationship with Jimmy Butler or the other players, but if a coach is definitely having trouble commanding his players, that's something the new coach needs to fix and something Josh Harris needs to take a look at when hiring the next coach. Outside of coaching, simply for morale, for the players, the fans, the organization, Brett needs to go. He's been here long enough. The Sixers haven't won shit. It is his time to go. However, Brett is definitely a part of the problem on the Sixers, but there are other major problems that need to be fixed for the Sixers to win moving forward. Brett is part of the problem. He's not the whole problem. People are treating Brett like the Catholic Church treated Jan Hus in the 1400s. Let's put the pitchforks away, people, and do some critical thinking. Because if Jesus Christ himself is the coach of the Sixers next year and nothing changes, we're going to be in the same spot. So farewell, Brett. Your time is up here. You seem like a nice guy. I wish you well. You will have a role somewhere in the NBA moving forward. Suspect number 2 is Sixers owner Josh Harris and all the other owners, all the minority owners, whatever you want to call them. This is going to be short, but when it comes down to it, these guys have the final say. These guys write the checks. These guys make the final decisions with their wallets. And the managerial thinking they have installed within the Sixers has not worked. It just hasn't, and I don't have any insider information, but I'm assuming they're not going to sell the team, so they need to seriously rethink the way they're hiring people that make the decisions on the players. Third suspect, former general manager Bryan Colangelo. Miss me yet? Now, like Brett, what about Bryan Colangelo hasn't been already said? After drafting Ben Simmons in the 2016 NBA draft, pretty much every single move he made was a failure, certainly in the draft. Drafting Markelle Fultz, drafting Anzej Pashanik, who now works as a plumber, drafting TLC, who no longer plays for us, trading Jeremy Grant. I could go on. Colangelo was not a good GM, and he definitely hindered the growth of the Sixers, but at least, and I can't believe I'm saying this, at least Bryan Colangelo understood that Ben and Joel needed to be surrounded by shooters in order for the Sixers to do well. And it is not all Bryan's fault that the Sixers are this bad right now, because it was never this bad under his leadership. And that takes a lot for me to say because I've been calling this guy a war criminal for the last 4 years. Now to a guy that clearly doesn't understand that Ben and Joel needed to be surrounded by shooters. That is, of course, the current general manager, Elton Brand. His first year as a GM was actually pretty successful. He was pretty ballsy, he took a lot of big risks. They didn't pay off, but the trades the Sixers made for Tobias Harris and Jimmy Butler were necessary for the Sixers to take a big risk and try and win a title. It didn't pay off because Kawhi played like a Greek god, but still. The Sixers were an unlucky bounce away from going to overtime with the eventual NBA champions in Game 7. Now you get to that offseason and you're unable to retain or attract any shooters. You sign Al Horford and Tobias Harris to 2 abysmal deals, and the rest of the year is just one big shit show. This tweet sent out by Markelle Fultz really stung, in hindsight being 2020, but it's still. The point being that Brand took some incredible risks that were ultimately short-term thinking that did not pay off. If the Sixers didn't do anything, they would still have a pretty good team after the 2018 NBA draft. It kind of reminds me of what I learned in school. Is if you invested in a routine, standard, and safe index fund rather than buying and selling stocks all the time, you would be much better off, most likely. High risk, high reward, but playing it safe usually gets the job done. And unfortunately for Elton Brand, he tried to invest in the next big stock, and unfortunately, that stock was Enron, and the players were Tobias Harris and Al Horford. Something needs to change, and I think right now Elton Brand deserves the majority of the blame for the Sixers season. He just didn't understand that Ben and Joel needed shooters. Picking the best guy just because they're tall doesn't mean they'll fit in this rotation, and they didn't. It was a disaster from the start to the finish. And then goes without saying, Sam Hinkie wasn't perfect here. He made some terrible decisions in the draft, like drafting Jahlil Okafor, but ultimately, he built the foundation for it. He doesn't deserve most of the blame. He wasn't perfect, though. But you do have to wonder, one of the joys of being a Sixers fan during the process years, there weren't many, but one of the joys is that we weren't burdened with terrible, terrible contracts. Hinkie actually exploited teams with terrible contracts, saying, yeah, we'll take that terrible contract off your hand if you give us a bunch of assets. Assets that built the Sixers for years to come. Now the Sixers are in the opposite position. They have the 2 worst contracts in the NBA right now. It is going to take a lot to get those off the hands for a fair price. I mean, the fair price doesn't exist. Getting any resemblance of something that is remotely fair would be a victory. And then, of course, you have to look in the mirror and blame yourself. I was cheering Elton Brand every step of the way. Should have done a little less cheering and done a little bit more of this. And also a little bit more critical thinking. Because it's a disaster. I'll take some of the blame. Put it on me. I can handle it. And then the last guy who deserves a share of the blame. Oh, no, you can't say it. It's not politically correct. I'm going there, bitch. Oh no, but he built the bubble. It was safe for all the players. I don't give a shit. It is the commissioner of the NBA, the most loved man in all of sports, Adam Silver. Because he was vocal and forceful in implementing the Colangelo disaster on the Sixers. And shit has gone sideways ever since, and I understand. Look, the Sixers team was a disaster during the process years. They weren't making teams any money on the road, and the owners complained because they were losing money when they hosted the Sixers. Fair enough. But this is incredibly short-term thinking. The type of short-term thinking that Bryan Colnagelo used to move up and get Markelle Fultz. The type of short-term thinking that Elton Brand used to sign Tobias Harris and Al Horford to crazy deals. This is short-term thinking, and you think now, the owners probably would have made up for it if Sam Hinkie was still there, or anyone with any critical thinking ability, because the juggernaut Sixers team would be making owners boatloads on the road right now. And I know everybody loves Adam Silver, but to me, he's just a PR head on the NBA that serves to exist for one reason: to make the owners money and serve the almighty dollar. That's just the reality of the situation. Now, moving forward about what the Sixers can do in the future. Like the Queen Doris Burke said in the game yesterday where the Sixers got swept, this is not one issue. This is not a Brett Brown issue. This is not just an Elton Brand issue. This is a top-down issue that needs to be fixed. Everyone needs to be held accountable. A lot of Sixers fans want the Sixers to clean house. That is, pretty much everyone not named Ben or Joel can go. Or at least we should be open on the possibility of every player in management leaving. Now that's much easier said than done. Obviously, Brett's probably gone. Brett's gone. Elton might be leaving, but Josh Harris will still be there. I mean, he pays for the electricity, he keeps the lights on, he pays the bills. That is kind of worrisome, because he is the one making the decisions, and he is responsible. At the end of the day, other people deserve blame, but he ultimately makes the final decisions on all the problems that I've just laid out for you. Sure, Brett and Elton aren't working, but Harris ultimately pulled the trigger on paying them and hiring them. You wonder, is Harris just going to get 2 more guys that don't work just as well? On the player side, the good news is that Ben and Joel are still here for a couple of years. They're still young, and they have both recently expressed in one way or another their love for this team in the recent days. Now let me check the other good news on the player side. Oh, that was it. That was all the good news. But no, there were some strides this year. Shake got a little bit better. Thibault had a good rookie year. But ultimately, those are 2 young guys who are light years away from being an essential piece on a championship team. They're going to have to keep improving for them to be a player that's considered untouchable. Won't happen anytime soon, but they have made strides this year. Keep improving, guys. But that's pretty much it. Everyone else on the Sixers should be prepared to go, and the fans are waiting for them all to go. Now, having said that, that is much easier said than done. This whole thing is much easier said than done. People are going to have to make serious, tough decisions in the coming weeks and months for this Sixers team to even be considered a contender going into the next season, whenever that may be. Most notably, Al Horford's contract and Tobias Harris' contract. Two very hefty contracts. They are good players, all things considered. They are not good fits for the Sixers. And when you consider how much they're getting paid, you may reconsider whether or not they actually are good players. I mean, for the dollar value, you're not getting much bang for your buck out of them at this moment. And I doubt any team is chomping at the bit to pay top dollar for Al Horford and Tobias Harris after the dog shit performance they had all season, especially in the playoffs. These guys' values right now are at an all-time low. And I know nobody wants to hear this, but in a desperate attempt to try and salvage whatever value these two guys may have left, the Sixers could get scraps and potentially even get worse trying to dump these contracts. Yes, that is a real possibility. The Sixers team could get worse. Godspeed to whoever the Sixers coach and general manager is going into this offseason, because they're going to need all the help they can get. The good thing, though, like I've said, is that we still have a strong foundation. Ben and Joel, some good young players. We have players that can play. The fit is atrocious, but we have players that can play. Now we need to find some shooters going into next year, because without shooters, I'm going to be making the same video next year. As well as, hey, the Thunder overachieved this year. They are a genuinely good team, meaning the Sixers will get their draft pick. The Sixers do have a first-round draft pick this year, so there is some good news. But one more time to echo the Queen Doris Burke. This is a top-to-bottom issue for the Sixers organization. It's not just Brett Brown, it's not just Tobias Harris, it's not just Al Horford, it's not just Keith Pompey, it's not just Bryan Colangelo, it's not just Josh Harris. It is a collection of all of them together that gave us this shit sandwich that was the 2019-2020 Sixers season. Burn in hell, I won't miss ya. And before I go, I just want to say that I would much rather prefer Al Horford's contract gone, dead, and buried than Tobias Harris. I think Tobias could still add some things to this team. I don't see Al Horford adding really anything to this team. Tobias' contract is bad, but he still can play well. He averaged close to 20 points this year. It wouldn't be the end of the world if Tobias were to come back next year. Now, 3-4 years down the road, we're still paying him top dollar and he's playing like shit. Yeah, that wouldn't be good. But he still can add some things next year. It's not the end of the world if Tobias is still on the Sixers next year, in my opinion. I know you're all chucking tomatoes at me. You're chucking tomatoes at your screen right now because it's not what you want to hear, but that's how I feel. But if you can trade Tobias and get something good out of it, then Tobias, pack your fucking bags because you're gone. Alright, that is the video. Thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Check out the website, great articles. Check us out on social media. As well as rest in peace to Mac Dre. He did it for the Bay.
Come on over here. Come on over here. No, you flipped me off. Come on, coward. No. Come on. You're not an intellectual. You're a fake and a fraud.